My name is Sonu Bedi. I'm a professor in the government department, and it is sort of my distinct pleasure to introduce this year's Stephen R. Volk Endowed Lectureship. This lectureship is sponsored by the Legal Studies faculty, the Dartmouth Lawyers Association, and the Rockefeller Center. I should ask if you could turn off your cell phones at this time. I know there's some interesting cell phone ringtones, but I don't think this is the form in which we want to hear them. So today's lecture is going to be given by Michele Goodwin. She is Everett Fraser Professor of Law at the University of Minnesota. She holds appointments in the law school, the med school, and the public health school. In a way, this points to the interdisciplinary nature of her work. She really is trying to seek to speak to various audiences, and I think it's a real virtue and brilliance, actually, of her work. Professor Goodwin spent the last year as a visiting professor at the University of Chicago Law School. Before that, she was the Wicklander Chair in Ethics at DePaul Law School, where she was directed their top-ranked Health Law Institute, and there she also founded the Center for the Study of Race and Bioethics. And Professor Goodwin is a leading expert, I would say actually the leading expert in the field of bioethics, biotechnology, genetics, and the law. She's a prolific writer, numerous articles and prestigious law reviews, author and editor of numerous books, including a forthcoming case book on biotechnology, bioethics, and the law. Her book, from Cambridge University Press, Black Markets, The Supply and Demand of Body Parts, insightfully and sort of provocatively critiques the current laws surrounding the sale and donation of organ body parts in the United States. And in a way, this book, like much of her work, sort of betrays categorization as either being on the left or the right. For instance, that book on body parts was praised by libertarians like Richard Epstein and liberals like Reverend Jesse Jackson. She is analytically rigorous, insightful, and you almost never hear this from an academic. She's almost always right. And her talk today is going to come from her forthcoming book on baby markets, also from Cambridge Press. And I must say, more than sort of a gifted and brilliant legal mind, she's a passionate, down-to-earth, and just plain awesome individual. She's been a mentor to me and many other academics. I'm really so thrilled to have her here with us today. And so it is with that and my great pleasure and enthusiasm that I introduce this year's Volk Lecture, Professor Michele Goodwin.
Thank you all so very much for being here, and I'd like to thank Professor Bedi for what a wonderful and gracious introduction. It's really appreciated, and what you all didn't know is we had a financial transaction about it beforehand, so he was, yes, an incentive was provided for that great introduction. And I'd also like to thank Judy Foster-Gill for helping put together this presentation, and also Sadhana Hall. So I know you're out there. Thank you very, very much. It's a pleasure to be here, in fact, a distinct honor. My talk today is going to be about baby markets and how we approach adoption in the U.S. The book itself deals with adoption and as well assisted reproductive technology. Today I'll be talking, will limit my talk to the adoption realm. So the notion that children might be placed with families according to an auction paradigm too closely resembles the repulsive practices of slavery. In an imagined version of auction competition, with a white billet in hand, one can push up the price of a child like a piece of furniture. In this imagined scenario, spirited competition weighs amongst us. Bidders are encouraged by the auctioneer, and an ebullient atmosphere. For any of you who've ever been at an auction, the atmosphere is pretty ebullient. People are happy at what they're bidding for. And perhaps in this sort of mythical scenario, After the bidding competition concludes with an unhesitating strike of the gavel, a birth certificate and baby are transferred. We may know very little about the winners, their character, composition, personality, integrity, or values. Or for the losers, for that matter, we may know very little about them except how high they were willing to bid on a child at a particular time. Now, this scene, this imaginary scene, most would abhor. Probably some of you are a bit disturbed by what I've described. Even those who are willing to consider a far more transparent, incentive-based adoption approach. The auction paradigm was, in fact, the slave model, and I think that's why people, in fact, would be so repulsed by it. And to know that paradigm, as Mary Jenkins Schwartz describes it, purchasers relied on external measures to gauge whether the child had the strength, dexterity, physical stamina, and good health necessary for completing plantation chores. In fact, we looked to the physical outside. We wanted to see their teeth. We wanted to see intimate body parts. We wanted to see their back, right? And there's something that's incredibly repulsive about that. And I think that's at the backdrop of our imagination, if you will, about contemporary adoption. It's perhaps what makes us very uncomfortable or unwilling, to some extent, to see the financial practices, the financial exchanges, and to account for what they look like in the context of supply and demand in adoption, or for that matter, assisted reproductive technology. So it's easier then to pretend that we don't have a market or a market-like system, because in the back of our imagination we know that slavery was in fact so repulsive. The concept of a free market in children is rejected based on what it symbolizes, including its argued resemblance to slavery or the auction block. Yet, directly and indirectly, market forces or economic considerations influence adoptions in the United States to a greater extent than traditionally acknowledged. Conventional wisdom and early legislation held that the best interest of the children should be at the center of all adoptions in the United States, which functioned in and of itself as a child welfare model for abandoned, abused, neglected, and orphaned youth. That was traditionally what adoption was about in the United States. Yet some would argue, including Ruth Arlene Howe, who has been a pathbreaker in this field, she would argue that contemporary adoption services, however, resemble free markets where aesthetic profiles of race, hair texture, eye color, and other market variables determine the welfare of children, or at least their likelihood of placement. Between two ends of a spectrum, one representing child welfare and the other adult needs, the latter influences U.S. adoptions far more than we imagine. So my project with the baby markets, and in fact this talk today, scrutinizes the financial considerations involved in adoption, including what I call baby valuing, and suggests that those transactions actually illustrate the market nature of adoptions in the United States. And so this project illuminates market consciousness in adoption processes, and it argues that economic interest influence adoptions more than what we would like to acknowledge. It demonstrates, this project, that adoption processes happen to be more like markets than less so today. And the project has three frames. In the first frame, I talk about the adoption market debate, arguing that current adoption indeed resembles this market, as I've suggested, and it describes just briefly what some of this actually looks like. The second part actually scrutinizes the moral and ethical obstacles to recognition of a market in adoption, the degradation of personhood, the charitable roots of child placement, and the social costs that are associated with adoption. And then the final part of this project and of the talk today, I examined alternative adoption models, which could include price caps, if you will, or taxation, if we wanted to. Ultimately, what I end up suggesting is that we need better information to be shared so that people fully understand what the impact of their decision-making happens to be and what it looks like. 30 years ago, Elizabeth Landis and Richard Posner attracted strident criticism in an article, 1978 article that was, they didn't title it this way, but it was colloquially known as the baby selling article. They attracted strident criticism. What they did was to apply a law and economics framework to the study of the pros and cons of incentives in adoption, as well as the mechanisms that could increase matching babies with parents who wanted the particular traits or characteristics of particular kinds of babies. Now, opponents decried the language of efficiency in evaluating adoption, suggesting that it reduced children to objects and in a very mechanical, economic way. What they may have failed to realize, however, is that the backdrop of the economic system had already existed, and what Landis and Posner were doing was actually pointing to what was already there and what would become even more on the horizon. Posner and Landis's critics characterize the article, which was actually titled "The Economics of the Baby Shortage," as promoting the introduction of financial incentives in the adoption allocation process, thereby giving Landis and Posner this sort of tainting what the article was actually about. And it also suggested that adoption processes in the United States up to that point were actually unflawed, and that it was pure altruism that was already leading adoptions in the United States, which was not necessarily the case. Some critics thereby dismissed the resemblance between the transactional fees that already existed, indirect incentives, which were already a part of the adoption sphere, and payments as simply not being there, though they were. We just simply didn't characterize them as being part of a law and economics model. Refusal then and now to acknowledge the financial incentives in adoption does not negate the free market's existence and its influence in adoption services. In other words, a community's preference that adoptions are free from financial transactions does not actually mean that it is so. Financial transactions and interest govern the adoption process both directly and indirectly. Financial exchanges including exorbitant fees paid to adoption agencies, medical payments to birth mothers or surrogates in the case of in vitro babies, transportation costs and living expenses can all be characterized under these sort of transactional costs. These, I argue, resemble payments in most other spheres. Some commentators, including Posner, have described these payments as part of the adoption black market. Now, to be clear, there's actually nothing illegal about these transactions and these transactional costs. Nothing at all about them that are illegal. Rather, exorbitant transaction fees and direct payments to parents and their attorneys are evidence of what I describe as a de facto, largely unregulated adoption free market. Now, I'll proceed with the next section in two parts. The first is us talking about the lack of regulation here as a first prong in looking at whether or not the free market exists in adoption. So several factors indicate the free market in adoptions. First, adoption services are largely underregulated and disorganized. Lack of regulation is a key factor in free market economics. Babies can be adopted indirectly through the free market by way of an agency process, wherein fees are bundled and an adoptive couple pays one fee that supports salaries for staff, medical expenses for the birth mother, and transportation costs. Babies can also be adopted directly through the free market via independent agents who facilitate the process, which includes lawyers, pastors, other religious clergy, and doctors acting as intermediaries or brokers, if you will. Unlike agencies, independent agents may be interested in only one specific adoption or two adoptions, and they're just facilitating getting the baby to the people that who would desire the baby. These processes are not monitored by any federal agency. Rather, it's state laws that govern this part of the adoption process, but are generally, the state laws that is, are generally inadequate in addressing the interstate and transnational aspects of adoptions. Thus, under the guise of promoting child welfare, contemporary adoption practices and policies have exposed children to a free market dynamic or free market dynamics. In the free market realm, supply, demand, and aesthetic preferences factor significantly in the cost of a baby. And the second part of this piece is to describe exactly how this valuing occurs. Baby valuing is indicated by racial and genetic preferences that attend this particular marketplace. Consider the following. Couples may spend upward to $50,000 to adopt a healthy white infant in the United States. Black infants, however, are adopted for as little as $4,000 in the United States. Adoption agencies attempt to clarify this discrepancy by explaining that black children are more difficult to place than white children, and therefore the costs associated with adopting Caucasian children are higher. Now, you may wonder how that logic is so. I mean, it would seem that if it actually takes more effort, more work time to place the black child, then in fact the cost would be higher in that realm and lower for white babies, placing them in adoptive homes. This logic, then, I argue, is flawed. Even though it is true that black children wait longer for permanent placement, why would it cost more to do less? If placing white children is easier than placing black children, it would seem that less work would result in less pay and lower fees. Instead, fee structures based on race give evidence that adoption is subject to free market forces of supply, demand, and preference. In this market, racial preferences matter. Biracial children, for example, also attract higher fees than black children. Even though it is estimated that 2 million American families are looking to adopt, the majority will pass over black children for children from abroad, right? So if you really want to adopt, and lots of black babies available, and it's pretty inexpensive to adopt them, 4,000, why would you go outside of the United States then to adopt others? A recent study reveals that the ways in which race matters in adoption. While 86.4% of black women would accept a white child, only 72% of white women would accept a black child, and only 1.8% of white women expressed a preference for black children. Most notably, though, more women expressed a preference for adopting a child with severe physical or mental disabilities than adopting a black child. In reality, adoption agencies and independent adoption agents establish fees with adoptive parents based on characteristics of the children in the adoption supply pool, such as race, gender, supposed genetic strengths, and including the search for intellectual aptitude. We know that doesn't always pan out, and we also see that in the natural selection as people try to gamble with the right partner to birth the right kind of child. And also we see that in the assisted reproductive realm. In the U.S., adoptions, white children are more highly valued than black children by both adoption agencies and those who seek to adopt them. Adoptive parents are acutely aware that competition is involved in free market adoptions. Thus, those serious about adopting white babies and with the resources to do so realize balking at the high costs associated with those adoptions would truly prove to be futile. But for the racialized nature of adoptions, the market in babies and children might be less detectable. If U.S. adoptions were primarily focused on child welfare rather than on adult need, the price of white children, I argue, would not exceed that of black children. Why spend more to adopt a white child if, in fact, the social service motivation is the same, to serve the best interest of the child? Thus, pursuit of the best interest of children in adoptions is an easily consumable fiction. Even if the rate of adoption for white children exceeded that of their black counterparts, black children would be second in line to foreign adoptions if the fulfillment of the best interest of U.S. children were, in fact, the reality. But sadly, it is not. According to the Department of Health and Human Services, many couples wait more than 18 months and spend as much as $30,000 to adopt children from abroad, bypassing the less expensive and the less desired black children. In fact, according to a recent report, adoptions of black children can be facilitated in less than 3 weeks in the United States. So how does this social valuing pan out? The third factor that provides evidence of a free market in the U.S. in adoptions is the use of social status of adoptive parents in the child allocation process, right? So what power do people have who are looking to engage in adoption? Adoptive parents' social status, including household income, family type, and immigration status even, figure significantly in adoption decision-making. Angela Kupenda, Zanita Fenton, and other child welfare law scholars provide a race-based critique of the challenges faced by families of color seeking to adopt children in the United States. According to these scholars, black families face greater obstacles in qualifying for child placements. They suggest that the prevalence of single-parent households and lower income status weighs against black families. Some others would also argue that it weighs against immigrant families too. Thus, potential black adoptive parents are comparatively less competitive players in the free market for children. They will lose more often than white parents, even if their goals are to adopt black children. More recently, immigrant status might affect whether or not parents are protected, or possibly parenthood is possibly protected or terminated. A prime example occurred when a Tennessee court recently removed an 11-year-old girl, Linda Barrera Cano, from the custody of her mother, a Mexican immigrant worker, and placed her with a family that, quote, lives in a brick ranch house with a basketball hoop in a driveway and a swimming pool in the backyard. Ironically, Linda Barrera Cano was never surrendered by her mother to the state, nor was she in foster care when she was placed with the Patterson family. Instead, Linda was simply a poor migrant worker's child who missed some days of school to babysit her siblings. One of Linda's teachers took a special interest in her and petitioned for her adoption. The case attracted considerable attention as Judge Barry Tatum demanded that the mother, Felipa Barrera, quote, learn to speak English before visitation even would be permitted with her daughter, who was never surrendered for adoption, whose first language is Spanish. Tennessee law provides for direct petition to courts in cases of child abuse and neglect. Most would view this law as a progressive law and in the best interest of children. After all, it avoids delays in removal, children being removed from dangerous situations. Deciding, however, whether this case and its aftermath have been focused on the welfare of the child or the desires of the adults is far more complicated. The facts of the Barrera case seem unique, but it does provide limited precedent for wealthier individuals to directly petition the courts to adopt hand-picked children. Poverty, immigrant status, limited political clout, and limited English proficiency may factor significantly then in one's ability to effectively compete for a child despite biological connections. Well, finally, private transnational adoptions also provide evidence of market competition. Foreign adoptions figure significantly in U.S. adoption services, with growth on two fronts. First, overwhelmingly, white couples who are unable to locate white children for adoption in the United States are increasingly looking and adopting white children from abroad and also from other countries, including China, Guatemala, Russia, and Eastern European countries. Couples who decide to adopt from abroad pay far more than the costs associated with adopting poor black children here in the United States. These costs include international transportation fees, transactional costs with foreign governments even, and local and foreign fees. In this way, they exercise another key component of free market choice. Another variable there. A notable trend is affecting the lives of African American children, and this may be one that we would not have imagined or predicted. Canadians, Germans, Swedes, and other predominantly white ethnic groups are adopting black children from the United States. Who would have thought that? With open adoptions, there are no restrictions on the adoptions of American children to foreign couples as long as they meet the requirements and fees established by adoption agencies and birth parents. Of the many ironies, one which has not escaped the scrutiny of commentators is the dramatic difference in costs associated with these particular adoptions. The adoption of African American babies and children usually costs less than half of the cost of adopting white babies or babies of color who are from abroad. Okay, so that was an attempt to give some contours to supply and demand and what that's looking like in the United States. The second part of this piece looks at the market pitfalls and some conventional wisdom. According to conventional wisdom, the needs and best interest of children would always prevail over the special interest of adults seeking to adopt them, just as I stated in the beginning. Conventional wisdom, therefore, rightfully rejected the proposition of a child being placed into an abusive home or family, or one that sought to exploit the child's labor, sex, or talent, right? We wouldn't want to place a child in a home where, in fact, the primary purpose would be for labor. And we certainly wouldn't want to place a child into a home where it looked like there could be physical abuse or sexual abuse. Indeed, adoption, as I stated in the beginning, is no longer a domestic welfare service that attends primarily to the needs of children born in the U.S. Rather, what we should realize is that adoption is a multi-million-dollar transnational service where aesthetic and genetic traits are significantly scrutinized, but there are pitfalls at times to the free market model where finances may prevail over child welfare and the best interest of the child. Critics of the free market and adoption have rightfully illuminated the tensions involved with financial considerations of sensitive subjects. For example, Professor Margaret Radden refers to the market inalienable. She argues that our very personhood is threatened by the rapid expanse of commodification in our daily reality. Yet, what even the most insightful critics may in fact fail to grasp or at times may overlook is the diminution of value according to race and social hierarchies that are born out of the free market model. The free market model is not like slavery at all. It is not. but it does reproduce the class and social distinctions found in the legacy of American slavery. Free market opponents have advanced two main ideological criticisms. The first criticism was that a market analysis was always inappropriate to the studies of human subjects. Secondly, critics suggested that although costs are involved in the adoption process, it is unfair and inaccurate to characterize those fees in market terms. In other words, to imply that the adoption process is subject to market forces or supply, demand, and preferences would actually tarnish or diminish the reputation of the industry. Unfortunately, though, financial incentives in adoption cannot be easily dismissed, nor can policymakers, scholars, and child welfare advocates pretend that by ignoring class and the considerable costs involved in domestic and international adoptions, that a market has not developed. To ignore the less attractive nuances of adoption is to presume that adoption services in the United States operate entirely on the best interest of the children and exclusively and always in the best interest of children. So let's talk a little bit about values and social impacts. And this is where I begin to tease out what exactly it is that we might want to do about this if, in fact, we see this as an issue needing any kind of redress. I mean, sometimes with markets, we're willing and we want them to flourish and go forward because it seems as if you have parties that are meeting each other's agendas, where you have a supply that is being provided and there's considerable demand. And if they're met coherently and cohesively, we could say that that is Pareto superior, right? Everybody wins, if you will. And maybe in situations where there is a win-win, then that is completely okay. Is there anything about this particular system that we would see that doesn't meet that threshold? So what I've attempted to argue here is that a free market in adoptions already exists and that altruism as a primary goal in adoption has been overshadowed by a supplication to parental desires. Financial incentives, payments to mothers, exorbitant fees provided to adoption agencies, and the robust enterprise of independent direct adoptions provide evidence of free market forces in adoption. Determining then whether the state has a future role in shaping the adoption market or allowing it to freely exist without state interference is a relevant and very timely question. Because parental autonomy has been so strongly guarded within the common law and constitutional law tradition, scholars may tend to overlook the government's arguable affirmative duty to be involved in this rather sensitive legal issue involving children. And just by example as to why, in fact, it is so deeply entrenched, our passion for allowing people independent choice with parenting could, in fact, date back to the 1920s, to 1927 in particular, in the Buck v. Bell case, which is a very interesting case in this regard. It involved a poor white girl from the state of Virginia, who at 16 had been raped and had a baby out of wedlock. Her mother was also poor. It was alleged that her mother was an alcoholic. It was also alleged that her mother had possibly been a prostitute. And at 16, the state of Virginia decided that Carrie should be sterilized. The state of Virginia was not the first state to implement a eugenics law, which would require, in fact, compel people who were thought of as degenerate to be sterilized. It was the state of Indiana in 1907 that actually implemented the first sterilization laws associated with eugenics practices. But it was Carrie's case, this model case, that went before the United States Supreme Court. And in that case, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes iterated that, in fact, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And what he meant by that is that rather than, as he said, rather than to allow these people to starve for their imbecility, or for the state to drain their coffers by incarcerating these people because of their motivation for theft and other kinds of crime, or to pay for their welfare because they won't work, that it's better, in fact, that we just sterilize these people. So Carrie was committed to an institution where, in fact, there were hundreds and hundreds of kids who were just like her, in fact, as young as 10 years old, who were sterilized by the state of Virginia. And in fact, it was later during trips to the United States by high-level government officials in Germany that Germany adopted the Virginia model law for eugenics and then put it into practice in Germany. And that was the beginning of their plan that would lead to horrors, deep horrors that we all regret. In fact, just as a side note there, in the United States during the 1920s, the 1930s, the premieres that would come on from movies were advertisements about how successful we were in sterilizing people that we thought were socially unfit. These were tens of thousands of poor white people in the United States that did not meet our model of fitness based on intelligence or based on their poverty. So, unconsciously, individuals can make choices that have significant implications for social policy, just as we did a century ago and less, the Buck v. Bell case and many others. That followed by the Skinner case, which was also a very interesting case that dealt with this issue of parenting. It was a case that involved a person who had been a thief, and it was a state that had a 3 strikes you're outlaw, and the out part meant that there would be sterilization again. And when this particular case was heard, in the 1940s, it was suggested that, in fact, one shouldn't be sterilized, shouldn't lose the opportunity to parent simply for stealing chickens. Ironically, in that particular law that would have led to the sterilization of the plaintiff in that case, there was an exemption for white-collar criminals. So it was only if you were sort of low-type criminal person that you could be subject to this sterilization rule. So the method that individuals use to make decisions with regard to acquiring children can have both positive and negative social consequences. To the extent that those individual decisions can negatively impact society economically, morally, or burden our social services, the state arguably has a role in regulation. In the context of adoption, individuals make choices that can have significant implications for a broader society about which society should, in fact, be concerned. If the byproducts of free adoptions are 2-tiered racial systems or racial hierarchies, it is an issue worth greater social scrutiny. Beyond race, society might also be concerned about middle-class whites and other groups being priced out of the market for white babies, which has a double negative effect. First, if the market responds only to the highest bidder with regard to white babies, it is possible that white babies will only be placed with wealthier white families. The problem created by the free market here is the legitimization of a troubling normative view that adoption should only be among the wealthy and ignoring class diversity in the United States, which could have a deterrent effect on class diversity adoptions or class diverse adoptions, which we might want. Second, well-meaning altruistic white parents who are able to share their home and love with another child, although not among the wealthiest in society, could be shut out of the adoption free market. Finally, there is the consideration of social involvement in shaping the lives of adoptees. Should we as a society be concerned that a special class of adoptees is created through free market adoptions? After all, wealth-based adoptions could lead to children being funneled into an elite class. How society addresses the free market in adoption or the individual decision-making in adoption will have a significant social impact. There are several options society might weigh, and each is uniquely burdened by what might be considered undesirable consequences by market proponents. Here I call upon the work of Neil Commissar, who studies markets and their imperfections sometimes, and also comparative systems, right? And the idea being that sometimes in our effort to try to do what's absolutely right means that we sometimes fall short, and in fact what we might want to do is to search for what is best, understanding that we don't necessarily reach perfection all the time. To the extent that agents are needed to service the adoption process, financial transactions will always be involved. Our challenge then is to determine a proper balance between the needs of children, government responsibility, and individual autonomy. Now, I'll wrap up very shortly here by just giving some examples that we can play with in terms of how we might want to address this issue. Now, one way that we might wish to address the market here would be through price caps. This would be to regulate the market by providing a ceiling on how much a transaction can be with regard to adopting a child. In this option, prices could be capped by the state. In this scenario, all adoptions would cost the same, regardless of the child's race, gender, religion, or other factors, including eye color, hair texture, or complexion. To the extent that even with price caps, the adoption of some children would be unaffordable, there could be adjustments. Critics would likely eschew this option as it interferes with individual autonomy and the free market. Others might oppose such an option because it actually unveils what we otherwise want to have unrevealed or hidden, which is the market in adoption. A second option that we could possibly explore is to monitor and to control the social impact of individual decision-making with taxation. In a taxation model, all adoptions with transactional fees would be assessed a progressive tax, meaning that the government-imposed fee would not be capped, but would be proportionate to the adoption fee. Under this proposal, all adoptions could have a 10% fee attached. Alternatively, adoption fees over a reasonable dollar amount could be taxed at a higher rate, similar to property taxes within various municipalities. Taxation actually helps to generate state and federal funds that can be used to promote the social welfare of children in foster care and adoption centers, thereby facilitating a positive social impact. For example, taxation on free market adoptions could be used to provide better care for children who are actually more difficult to place, including children with disabilities, older children, Black children. Funds generated through taxation could also help to fund private foster care or permanent placements. Now, critics might equally be troubled by this model and suggest that it detracts from adoptions of desirable babies by taxing well-meaning couples out of the adoption process. Moreover, they could argue that individual autonomy is compromised through government taxation on adoption. Such criticisms, though, while true, are not so compelling as to limit governmental interference or interest in promoting the health and safety of all children. Nor, it seems, are adoptive agents' interests so severely burdened by this type of government involvement that a protected interest is violated. Now, finally, another option, information. A final option to address the negative social impacts of the free market is the broader sharing of information. Government-sponsored information campaigns have been used to promote organ donation, anti-smoking campaigns, entreaties for mothers not to drink alcohol during pregnancy or to take drugs, and even more invasive efforts with regard to abortion. In the context of abortion, some states mandate a waiting period and that information be provided to the woman or girl seeking to have an abortion. Could this type of a model be used with adoption? Currently, adoption agencies provide information to prospective parents, but perhaps there is an additional role for the government to the extent that adoptions are not conducted in isolation, but impact the entire society. This third option of greater governmental involvement through increased information as to the social impact of race-based decision-making in adoptions is perhaps the least invasive of the three models. In order for Americans to truly understand the socioeconomic implication of adoptions, they must be provided with good information. Currently, the federal government does not take a role in providing information to adopting parents about the racial and socioeconomic impact resulting from an adoption process driven by aesthetic preferences and perpetuated by a free market. So those are models, and there's more that I could share with you about information. And certainly one point that I should share is that critics of information-driven remedies might rightfully identify certain shortcomings of such a policy-based proposal, including that it provides no guarantees of placements for Black children or for disabled children, right? It's just sort of empty in that way, they could suggest. And they would be right in that. Yet it seems that there is, as stated earlier, a valid government interest here and indeed an obligation to proactively act on behalf of children in the United States in this adoption limbo. So now let me conclude, and I'd be very happy to entertain your questions. If market forces actually exist in adoptions, should there be any state regulation? Even Posner agrees that the vulnerable status of children requires some level of state participation and oversight in adoption processes to the extent that exploitation and the denigration of children might exist. How should the fine line of state responsibility and prospective parental autonomy be balanced? Greater state involvement in adoptions could create bureaucracies that have a deterrent effect or slow the adoption process down altogether. Children who otherwise would be adopted may have to wait longer. Indeed, there are pitfalls to government involvement, but with attention to those problems, I think that they can actually be overcome. The attacks on marketplace inquiry in the realm of adoption generated by Posner's baby-selling article unintentionally serve to obscure the less altruistic aspects of adoption practices in the United States. That criticism also ignored relevant questions in the supply and demand of children. The backlash to some extent stifled dialogue about the realities of adoption in the United States. Scholars have not rigorously scrutinized the market nature of adoptions and child supply. I'd say that Deborah Spar, in her most recent book, and Deborah Spar is now the new president at Barnard, recently published a book that really attempts to unpack that. Greater dialogue is needed on this question that constructively examines the roles of government, judges, adoption agencies, and independent agents. And this work and my forthcoming book is an attempt to get that dialogue started. And thank you very much. Yes.
Professor Goodwin, thank you very much for that talk. I wonder if you could talk about
Bruce?
something that strikes me as I wonder if you could talk to an issue that seems hidden by the market paradigm, and that is the role of government in inflating the market for certain babies. And I'm talking about government practices that have led to withdrawal or removal of children, particularly African American and especially American Indian children, from their families at rates vastly disproportionate to their representation in the population. And so you've talked a lot about back-end market forces. This is sort of a front-end market force. And so if government has played a role in producing a huge market for African American and Native American babies, then isn't government really the major culprit in upsetting the market in the beginning?
Historically, that has certainly been true, and one certainly can see how it plays out, and has played out in indigenous communities around the world, including in Australia with Aboriginal children. Rabbit Fences, I believe, was the name of the film, a very provocative and powerful film that dealt specifically with that question. And certainly we've seen it in North America too, and profoundly in Canada as well, with Indigenous children being removed as, again, part of a social program that assesses social value, right? Where parents who are deemed to have limited social value and social worth more easily have their children removed from the home. Right? I think it's a brilliant question. There's an article that I have forthcoming in the George Washington Law Review, and it's called Prosecuting the Womb. And what it attempts to do is actually look at some of the state intervention that surrounds or that sort of promotes this sort of removal, right? Because some would say, well, it's really inaccurate to say that government is just coming in and plucking out children, right? So what are the mechanisms behind the sort of plucking out, at least today? I mean, I think there was an even stronger case for it years ago when it was just simply, you just simply don't represent the right marker, right? And we see that historically with slavery, right? That is what slavery was all about. You have absolutely no connection to your child. It was the story of Margaret Garner, for whom the book Beloved was written around, and Margaret Garner was a slave on a plantation in Kentucky, and when the Ohio River froze over, she walked across it with her children, and when the slave owner and sheriffs tracked them down, she began to try to kill her children. She went to Cincinnati, crossed the river into Cincinnati, and went there because because Ohio was a free state. But what was very interesting is a sort of postscript of attempting to kill her children, where she killed one, and by the way, 3 of them were mulatto, and it is strongly believed that it was, in fact, her owner who was the father of the children. What is very interesting about the case is that she is not charged with murder, but destructing his property. Right, the sort of idea that you cannot, have presence with your own child. More recently, and in this article, I talk about one of the mechanisms that lead to children being pulled out of the home, which is the known sort of drug abuse of parents. And what's interesting is you're absolutely right, the sort of distinction between how we look at drug use, right? So if a person has been using crack or another illegal drug, this gives some legitimacy to the prosecutor's charge against the parent, right? And there are cases from South Carolina and any number of states where actually doctors have also been complicit in turning over the urine samples and blood samples to police and prosecutors, and then women being placed in jail. And in the South Carolina cases are really quite notorious. What's interesting, and in my research for this particular article, was looking at those patterns in South Carolina in a series of cases that ultimately wound their way up to the Supreme Court, with women being incarcerated who had taken crack, let's say, legal drugs during pregnancy. The overwhelming majority of the women who were prosecuted, prosecutorial discretion, were black. The only white woman who was actually prosecuted from this hospital that turned over samples was a white woman, and on her chart, the nurse had written she sleeps with and her boyfriend is a Negro, right? And we're not talking about the 1950s. We're talking about the late 1990s, right? So yes, right. I mean, you're making the point that the government has a part in this. I mean, I guess it's a complicated issue because, in fact, what we don't necessarily want are people who are taking drugs during pregnancy and posing harm to their fetuses. And the question is, how do we provide help to them? Do we see this as a disability? One of the key cases coming out of those South Carolina cases is the case of Regina McKnight. And I think it provides an interesting context for this because Regina McKnight had lost her mother, was raped, And it is documented that she also had some mental health issues as well. Knowing all of this, the doctors and nurses who serviced her, rather than trying to get her help for what she had just undergone in a space of 6 months, instead turned her urine samples over to the police. That was probably not very helpful, and she was convicted on a sentence of 20 years, and later it was reduced. But anyway, I certainly do get your point, and I think it's a very, very provocative one. Yes.
I have a question. It's kind of picky, but I was just wondering about the statistics you gave.
Sure.
And when you said have a preference, did they have the option, when women were asked, African American women were asked if they'd prefer or be willing to adopt a Caucasian child, and when white Caucasian women were asked the same question? When the questions had to do with preference, were they offered the option of no preference? And were they asked if they would be willing to adopt, not just prefer?
Well, what I'll do is what I will do is give you a site to the study itself, so that you can further pursue that. So the study was conducted by Anjani Chandra, and it's in the article Adoption Seeking and Relinquishment for Adoptions in the United States. And it's published in Advanced Data, May 11th, 1999. And after the talk, I'd be very happy to share that specific site with you. You're very welcome.
I'm interested in what organizations out there are exhibiting best practices as far as agencies or maybe even individual agents. Who out there is doing the right things in your mind? And then how can students get involved in the way of internships or in the way of researching those out there who are following best practices? And then on the adoption side, and then also on the policy side of these things.
Well, one thing that I would point you to is that there are now a couple of organizations, interestingly, in the state of Illinois, and I'll describe what they're doing that I think is pretty interesting. There are churches that are providing homes and resources for families that are willing to take children in, so as to overcome the hurdle of this family happens to be a renting family, or this family happens to live in a neighborhood that may seem less than desirable. There are churches that have come together to actually buy condos and place families rent-free in those condos that are willing to take in children. And I think that is a terrific model. In some ways, one can also see that as an incentive-based model, and I don't think that all incentives are necessarily bad in any way. I mean, I think that we're fully entrenched in the system that we currently have. So I think what we really need to do is think about, well, how best do we reform a system that allows us to balance as much as possible, that perhaps doesn't provide overwhelming governmental influence, as we talked about earlier, where the government plays a very direct hand in creating the paradigms where children are displaced from their families. And I would add to that, as one of the byproducts, what we presumed in Australia when Aboriginal children were taken from their families, or in Canada, or here in the United States, is that, well, they would have a better life when they were removed. But there are a number of things that we didn't take into account: the power of love, the power of community, what the National Association of Black Social Workers suggested, and there's been considerable controversy over this as well, which was that black children shouldn't be placed with white families, which in effect has had its own backlash, right? So as a defense of white parents who now would say, well, we would have wanted to adopt black children, but my goodness, there were so many obstacles that were presented by national black organizations against it. Now what we've done is to look elsewhere. And that is, too, completely understandable. And so the assumption that somehow, though, that children were better off, we see that that does not always pan out, especially if children are taken from homes and placed into foster care and are in an interminable status in foster care. What we know, and while parents also, by way of that question, are in prison, we know that children who grow up with parents in prison are more likely to go to prison themselves, less likely to finish high school, less likely to end up gainfully employed. So there are significant ramifications and byproducts of children being taken from homes rather than for us to try to help reinforce, if you will, the strengths of families and to help keep families together that can be sustained. And as far as organizations are concerned where students may be interested in doing work on these issues, I would strongly suggest that they get in touch with Ruth Arlene Howe. Ruth Arlene Howe is at Boston College Law School. She's actually on a emeritus status now, but I think she's really been a trailblazer and forerunner in this field. In fact, she was, in the very early 1970s, conducted a 3-year study that was just praised, that looked at adoptions in the United States. Now, over the last 30 years, there have been changes, but I think she's still considered one of the groundbreaking persons in this area. And also, I have to say as well, that I'm not an adoption expert, but what I wanted to do is to look at this as an issue that had market norms. Mm-hmm. Sure.
I've heard the arguments against interracial adoptions. What's the problem with, you said Germany and other countries
Adopting black children.
Black children from the U.S. That sounds to me to solve the economic problem and the social problems as well. Is that accurate, or are there other problems that I'm not seeing on its face?
Well, again, another very good question. I don't see that as a problem. I could see it as a good thing for children to be removed from foster care situations. I think what the tension happens to be in one section that I dealt with in this paper is the fact that it still may be very difficult for poor families, white or black, to be able to adopt. And by poor, we can even be talking about working class. And what we have to remember is that we've had a legacy in this country with immigrant families, black families, Native American families, having broad families. I mean, poverty or the lack of wealth did not stop people from having loving homes and from bringing children in and bringing children up with a lot of love and with a lot of promise. And so what I would say is that it's an opportunity, and an opportunity that's very unique and provides great possibilities, I think, for black children to have a more international experience. And yet at the same time, what I think that we wouldn't want to ignore is the challenge that's faced by working class families, white, black, Asian, Latino, across the board, from being able to show their love and bring children into their families.
Adoption is a fascinating topic because it obviously connects to so many things that are policies that actually go beyond even the subject of your particular studies or your book. In fact, sort of family policy, placement policy, and then something that's been kind of implied here, sort of the experiences of adoptees, whether they're in transracial or same-race families and such. And these are all huge issues that go in various directions, and you're to be definitely applauded for trying to tackle some part of this, because it goes everywhere when questions come up. But I'll ask what may be a kind of difficult question here is, what do you feel, given that you've named a number of, I guess what you could say, characteristics on which are irrelevant for the market competition for children, what do you think are the
relevant.
characteristics.
My goodness. That's one that I'd want to study for a while. I think it's a challenge, I think, for me, and maybe for others, I don't know, and I'd be very happy to have a dialogue about this. It's difficult for me to think about, at least as it relates to children, what should be the best markers for children that respond to a value, right? Because we could think about any number of things, right? Is this a quiet child? Is this a studious child, right? You sort of see, marks up for quietness, marks up for, very smart, gets good grades in schools, athletic, right? All of these could be markers for why that particular child where there'd be higher transactional costs for adopting that kind of child, right? Or lower transactional costs if the child is troubled, has attention deficit disorder, or any of those things. And I find those things really somewhat problematic, looking at children and evaluating based on their particular markers. So then you say, well, what are the kinds of categories? Could you, is it based on parents, right? Now, some, you might say demographics by geography might be possible, right? So that you could say in communities where the cost of living happens to be lower, possibly, that the cost of those adoptions should perhaps be lower. Possibly, I don't know. I'd want to think that through a bit more and to push myself on that. But that's certainly one possibility that's not attached to the child at all, but is just connected more directly with the costs of living and the some ways the sort of value of the sort of economics of the people who are actually adopting. You could also think about this in the context of a scale, right? So based on the wealth of the family, right? So that we have a scale. If you make over a certain amount of money, then here's how much you contribute to the adoption pool. And we could think of it that way, that it's not really a market exchange, but in fact what we have is a pool for the sort of health and betterment of children. And if you make, under $50,000, here's how much your contribution is. I mean, in some ways, those are all sort of obfuscations, maybe. I'd want to think about that more. It's a great question, and it's a question that really gets me stumped. The first part of it is to say that I'd want to reject it. I just want to reject the sort of market factors altogether associated with children.
Could you give us a little more detail about the information strategy, in particular, what kind of information, how much, and to whom the information would be distributed?
Sure. So this information, what we'd want to think through is by state, by local community, for example, how many children are in foster care, for example. How long have those children been in foster care? What are the costs to the state, and what are the emotional costs to the children who have excessive weights in foster care? What are their lives like, these children who are waiting? Now, interestingly enough, we do this with pets. We do it all the time. You see, if a dog's been waiting, and in a kennel, and the dog might die, is going to be put down. I mean, everything about the dog. And he's really sweet. That little limp that he has was caused by this. He deserves a really good home. He's very affectionate with kids, and all of these kinds of things. Now, what it exposes again is a sort of kind of transparency. Like, why are we sharing this kind of information? And there's something uncomfortable about it, and yet at the same time, it does have an emotional pulse. And I think that emotional pulse is very informative to parents, right? So I think that some of that information we would want to share, costs associated with the state, costs associated with the child, and there I'm talking about the emotional cost and toll that it takes on the child being in foster care and how long those children have been in foster care. And there's other information that we would we'd want to know adoption rates in the state. I mean, I could imagine there a plethora of information that would be passed on, and possibly even some form. It seems that already we have delays that are built into the system, and I think that's a basis of inefficiency. Those delays don't happen to be because we want for you to fully think this through and have a full understanding of the impact of your decision making when you choose to go out of the country and adopt versus adopting a child right in this city who's available and what that impact might happen to be in this city, right? It's not that people are waiting because they're evaluating all of that. They're waiting because there's some inefficiency someplace else. So those are some of the pieces of information that I think would be important to be shared, and much more.
If we don't have any more questions. Oh.
I was wondering, and you touched at the end of your presentation on like the potential sort of policy recommendations, whether or not you think those types of campaigns or legislation are more effective like on a federal level or on a state or even like local level. What's the kind of scope that people can take to look at this issue?
Well, it's quite possible that we could have a form of federalism here that works in some seamless way with federal policy as well. From the state level, we have a better idea about how foster care is affecting the specific state. And have more information about the personality, if you will, as a general term, with adoption in the state. So I think that state models are actually quite important. And yet at the same time, I think that the federal government should, in fact, have a role, perhaps, even if only in the beginning what we do with assisted reproduction, which I don't think is fully effective, but it's a start. And that is, with assisted reproduction, what we require on the federal level is that clinics each year respond to essentially a survey. And the survey is called success rates. And there's something illusory in that because, we don't really follow the children to find out if whether or not there have been any health problems after there's been a child born through assisted reproduction, right? But clinics are to alert the federal government with how many women have sought reproductive services, what their age groups happen to be, what kind of services it was that they sought out, how many of these women who utilize services actually became pregnant through the utilization of those services, and a bit more like that. It's not incredibly invasive at all. Those charts are made public, right? So there's a database through the CDC where you just look up, 2004, 2005 ART success rates. So it's public, it's available, it's not invasive, but it's very useful information, and I use it often in my scholarship, right? I can go and I can look and I can see, well, women who are over the age of 40 are more likely than not to have triplets or higher order births than women who are under, it's good information. And I could see the same kind of information sharing on the federal level with adoption, while leaving it to the states to have perhaps a bit more involved role.
Hi, I was wondering if you had any, this is sort of tangentially related, but I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the emerging international surrogacy market and how that pertains to race and class intersections.
Sure, that's a great question too. The book, as I said, actually deals with adoption as well as assisted reproductive technologies. And there's been considerable controversy, particularly this year, on international surrogacy, specifically with programs that are taking place in India. And some of those programs in India where women are surrogates for people in the United States who'd like to become pregnant, there are services that are provided to these women, including training, education training, workforce training, and housing is often provided. Now, many argue that, in fact, it's very coercive, right? And the same is applied to sort of transnational services with regard to organ transplantation that take place on the black market, where it's suggested that what we're really doing is exporting our demand and our problems abroad, and that those problems are being addressed by people who otherwise aren't in the best position to make clear decisions for themselves because they are in desperate economic straits. And so in such a case, it's argued that there's a level of coercion that may be higher in those instances than otherwise. There have been some scholars in the United States that have suggested that women of color should avoid being surrogates because it's reminiscent of a slavery paradigm. And I think in many ways that's sort of turned on its head, really. And I even think that the model in India that I described actually provides considerable benefit to the women who are providing those kinds of services when they're coming out perhaps better off after that 9-month period with than they were perhaps going in, and if in fact they are well informed. Informed consent does matter in all of these kinds of transactions. But what's interesting, and what I think that we'd want to guard against, is too much paternalism, right? Which would suggest that poor people and people of color will always be incapacitated to make sound decisions for themselves, and that the only people who should be able to enter their body, if you will, into a sort of commercial mode would be people who are better off and well educated. Now, I think that that's somewhat problematic. Also, what I think that we would want to remember, because we sometimes think in other realms that the only people who participate as the people who have demand happen to be of one particular class. I would say that in the assisted reproductive realm, while it is true that the high costs associated with it would limit those who typically seek those treatments to be wealthier people, and in the past, white people. That's changed quite considerably, right? Just by example, in terms of how those dynamics play out, at Stanford, just a year or so ago, there was an advertisement for an egg donor who was from India. They were looking for a woman from India, an Indian couple, and they were willing to pay up to $100,000 for her egg donation, right? So it's an example that, this isn't, in those instances, all just sort of, wealthy white couples who are seeking out, and looking to exploit poor women and poor women of color in these exchanges.
Well, I guess that's all.
All right. Thank
Thank
you
you
all
very
very,
much.
very much for coming. I really appreciate it.